Okay. So, hello, my name is Julia Gallo, and I've been in Zaratan residence for a month and a half, and I came here without the intention of doing a final work or a final project, but I came with some research desires, so to say, that I wanted to do in the context of Lisbon, and this is what I'm going to share with you today a little bit. And often in my work process, I ask myself questions which I almost never have the answer. Um, and I decided to start with a question I was asking myself when I left Brazil. I believe that you know that we are going through an extremely difficult and troubled political moment. And my question was, what body do we need to build to go through all this? So I would like to leave this question in the air, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've done in the last 3 years. I've been working mainly with charcoal drawings and animation made with graphite and butter paper. And I'll show some pictures of the works that I did, and it's kind of hard to show this in the screen, but because they are quite large works. But let's go. These are some of the drawings. And can you understand me? Because sometimes I speak too quickly. Is it okay?
Okay.
Okay. So these are some of the drawings I'm making, and these are some of the details. Um, I'm going to show two animations I've made. Uh, Again, it's kind of hard to show here in this context because, especially with the animations, the way the work is shown in the spaces is extremely important to me because they are not meant to have a beginning or an end or a narrative. The idea is that they are shown in a loop and remain like this in the exhibition space, and whoever enters can stay as long as they wish. So the movements, they don't have a linear perspective or a conclusive perspective, but an extended one. So in this way, I think they resemble a lot the way you may relate to a painting or a drawing. This soundtrack was made, both soundtracks were made by a friend of mine named Max Hussar. We work together a lot. And I'm going to show a little bit of what we have done. This is one. This is the other one that we presented. The soundtrack changes during the Okay. So it's really hard to show because the images are really low quality, but I think you could get a little bit of the idea. And what interested me and interests me in these works was to explore a specific notion of body and more than that, the body movement. It was a desire to talk about a state of non-consummation of a body that moves incessantly in detour, somehow sort of a tormented state that seems to be present in several dimensions of the human existence. So in this sense, I'm interested in a possible analogy between various events, certain experience, which although seem distinct, carry some kind of common point, even in their specificities. So it's a perspective of movement in which one runs toward a kind of wish for completeness, but in the end this only reveals a certain state of necessarily non-consummation or failure or unfinishing or permanent deviation, and this manifests itself in different situations which are full of particularities. It's something that seems to be present either in human love or sexual relationships or in religious experiences, relationships between life and death, in sports, in conflicts, fights, battles in general. But these are all experiences that, in their own way, seem to have a common point of a body that wants the kind of approximation to itself, that insists, but it's unable to produce this relationship conclusively. So it's a kind of trouble or feverish, tormented state. And in this sense, this imaginary for me is very connected to the idea of a body that twists itself, that contorts itself, when confronting this perspective of unfinished, uninterrupted movement. So the body twists, crumbles, weakens, falls, wobbles, breaks down. And I brought here a quotation from a test by a French philosopher that I like very much. It's from a test called "The Body That Can't Not Stand Anymore," and he says, as if he could no longer act, could no longer respond to the act of form, as if the agent had no more control over him. Bodies no longer form themselves, but instead progressively give way to all sorts of deformations. They meander, they crawl. They scream, moan, tremble in all directions, but they are no longer acted by they are no longer acted upon by acts or forms. It is as we touch the very definition of the body. The body is the one that can no longer stand, that can no longer can rise anymore. Um, and all these questions linked to the condition of the contemporary body, to me, are also related, as I said before, to religious experiences. And I come from a very Catholic family and a very Catholic country, but I'm not Catholic at all. But I grew up immersed in a imaginary of sacred art, and a reference that has always been extremely important to me are the images of the Brazilian Baroque, especially the one in Minas Gerais. And perhaps the most famous figure of this movement is the artist Aleijadinho. And it's obvious that the Baroque culture in Brazil, it comes from the Portuguese colonization, but in Brazil, the Baroque gained very particular characteristics, and in this context, it's important to me to highlight that the Brazilian modernists were concerned with an investigation on what could be Brazilian art, understanding Brazil as the result of an extremely violent history, and an encounter between different cultures, a miscegenation of cultures, made long researches that understood the Baroque as the first manifestation of art that could be considered effectively Brazilian. So why? I'm gonna bring here a fragment of a text that was in a catalog of an exhibition that took place last year in MASP, which is a museum in São Paulo, called the exhibition was called Images of Aleijadinho. So the exhibition talked about the legacy of Aleijadinho. It had works attributed to Aleijadinho, but also his followers and contemporary artists. And they said, One of the elements of recent Brazilian tradition is the Baroque, which has been introduced by religious missions, especially Benedict and Jesuit, and in the hands of native and black artisans, it has experienced curious transformations. Due their imperfect and sparse technical skill, it resulted in strange and striking forms, works of art in which the symbol of the grape cluster became the pineapple, the heron took place of the dove. And I also brought this text, which is a quote from a text by Mário de Andrade, which is a Brazilian modernist, in which he analyzes the figure of Aleijadinho. From all these examples, new artists are born in the colony who are deformed without possible systematization in the over-the-sea lesson. So I bring these references to draw attention in how in Brazilian Baroque European models are transformed or deformed, so to speak. So colonial religious art in Brazil was essentially the work of the so-called naive artists. They were free somehow from the rigidly formalism of the art produced by the religious congregations. So it mixed European references with references from the local fauna and flora. I'm kind of cold. And another important aspect is that, unlike the European Baroque, these human figures, they are not entirely white. So they mix black and indigenous white traits, and it creates its own aesthetic. And later, also in this text by Mário de Andrade, this guy, he will describe Aleijadinho as a systematic deformer, so a deformer with a great freedom of invention, with the ability to evoke primitive Italians, the Gothic, the European Baroque. And Mario defends that he embodies what will be this cultural miscegenation, this encounter of very different people coming from very different cultural backgrounds, and that were now living in the same land and not very peacefully. And for me, the idea of coming to Portugal, where part of these elements came from, was very interesting, because what is particular about the Portuguese Baroque, and only being here I could understand that, is that it's already the result of many cultural encounters. So of course it carries all these values that we historically associate with the Baroque, such as the presence of tumultuous forms linked to this tension between the Renaissance principles and the Christian ethics. The uncertainties of the Baroque man in reconciling these opposite elements. That's something that we can see in these sculptures, motifs with turbulent movements such as these, and also very theatrical images that deal with dramatic poses and high shadow contrasts, uh, which is called chiaroscuro in Italian. That is also something related to the idea of seduction and persuasion of the faithful. But besides all these elements, something that is very particular about the Portuguese Baroque, its relationship with the navigations and the Portuguese colonization, and also the idea of the Portuguese identity linked to this figure of the explorer, of the one who discovers. So I mapped Lisbon. In Lisbon, everything I could find associated with Baroque and sacred art in general, and I saw some very interesting things that were a lot of things, but some of them were, for example, nautical symbols. So these are typical from the Manueline style, which is very famous. So is this decorative style in which you have all these nautical motifs. And one second. Nautical motifs, mostly knots, moorings, and sculpted on stone, but also anchors, flags. So you can see that in Torre de Belém, for example, which, if you pay attention, is all decorated with these knots sculptured on stone. Also Mosteiro dos Jerônimos. these tweets, this movement, they appear linked to to an element of the navigation and expansionism. Another thing that called my attention was this ocean coach, which was an allegorical coach that was made to show and celebrate the achievements of Portugal. So we have Apollo here that sings about the Portuguese achievements, and these two female figures representing summer and spring, and here these two male figures that represent the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and they shake hands, symbolizing the passage of the Cape of Good Hope. So it celebrates the achievements of Portugal, but it's made in a very Italian-inspired style. And this is another Manuelin figure that is in the Museu Nacional de Arte Antiga. Another thing that really caught my attention was this Christ, which is an Indian Christ. So it's a Catholic image with a clear influence on Indian sculpture, which has a certain rigidity, and they actually don't have movement at all. And Jesus also appears with slightly Oriental traces. And the material comes from an animal of the Indian flora, and I found really amazing how the material gives this impression that the sculpture has veins somehow. And of course the tiles themselves, which is perhaps the most obvious thing that comes to our minds when we think of Portugal, but it comes from China, from a Chinese tradition. So one amazing place is Palácio Marquês da Fronteira, which is entirely decorated with the shards of broken tiles that were coming from China by boat, because most of them didn't survive the journey. It's all made with the shards of the Chinese tiles, so they are not produced in Portugal. But what really interested me in my work, because the Portuguese Baroque already carried all this reference, and these field researches are the things that are taking most of my time in the residence. But what really interested me in my work was how this perspective of the Baroque, of these bodies, of these twists, can be related to think the body in the contemporary times. So I'll go back to my question that I threw in the air in the beginning of my talk. What body do we need to build to go through all this? So as I said, it's not a question that it's meant to be answered, but what I've been wondering seeing all these Baroque images is, isn't this idea of the body that contours and twists itself when confronting something that is unknown interesting to think about the body today? So during the field research, I've been thinking a lot about this, making drawings and notes about this, and one of the associations I've made was the idea of esgotamento. I struggle a lot to translate this word, and I didn't make it because it's a very hard word to translate, because it's not necessarily linked to the idea of exhaustion or the feeling of being tired. So some approximations that I got would be this, emptiness, burnout, deflection, or drain. But it's more connected with a state of emptiness, and somehow of permeability. I came across this word in a text by a teacher who works in Brazil called Peter Paupelbar. He's a philosopher and works in the faculty of psychology at PUC. He was my teacher, and it's a university in São Paulo. And he teaches in Brazil, and he has been living there for a long time, but he's actually Hungarian, which is another place going through an extremely difficult political time. But in this text, which is called Esgotamento, he talks a lot about living in a state of suffocation, and which comes from a hyper-stimulate world, a very aggressive world that requires our attention 24/7. And he writes about how one can live in this world, and therefore makes a differentiation between two figures. One will be the figure of the survival, and another one will be the the figure of the esgotado. So one of the ways to react to this world would be to build an armor against it as a survival strategy. So this will be the idea of the survival. The survival is this body that, when going through so much stimulation, so much suffering, anesthetizes itself, closes itself, and to deal with this. So this body cannot be affected by anything anymore. He's a hard and strict, inaccessible body. And I think what led me to ask this question when I was still in Brazil, so what kind of body do we need to build to go through this, is linked to this state of suffocation. And why? Because it's really virtually impossible to survive a daily life where we have news like that appearing in the newspaper every day. So if we don't anesthetize ourselves, it's impossible to survive. The body just can't take it, and this makes us produce sort of an army against experience as a survival strategy. It creates a narcosis. And in Peter's text, he makes a differentiation between the figure of the survivor and the one who is esgotado. So while the survivor shields, the esgotado is that body that, although living in the same world as the survival, has come to a state of extreme emptiness, of permeability. So it's a body that still has the power to be affected. And so I've been asking more questions, and they have changed a little bit. When I was writing this talk, one of the questions I was thinking about in Portuguese was how como estar à altura de sua fraqueza, and I struggle a lot to translate it, and I didn't make it again. But some other images appeared in my struggle to translate. So, how to stand tall for a weakness, how to be weak, how to allow yourself to be weak. How can one be strong enough to be weak? So I've been thinking about how can we preserve this permeability, how can we preserve the ability to contort ourselves, to twist ourselves when facing something that seems unbearable. And how can we preserve the ability to be affected and to be strong in our weaknesses, because this will not be possible in a shield and closed body. And how to differentiate this surviving body from a body that allows itself to be affected, because every living subject is affected by the forces of the world, and it's our responsibility, I think, somehow to preserve that. So I started with one questions, and I'll end up with a dozen more questions, but that's what I have to share as some of the sensible experiences I had in my time here. And I'll end up with a poem of Brecht that was sent to me when the elections results came out. And I wrote it in the back of my notebook, so it also has been a companion in this last month. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Questions?
More.
Could you understand me? Sometimes I go too quick. It was okay.
Do you have more work to show?
I have, please come to the open studio, but I have many, I've been working mainly with, because for me it doesn't make sense. I don't think the point of a residence is to produce final works. It's more to make notes and to gather ideas. And I've been working a lot with the animations, and I have to work like a whole day to make 10 seconds of an animation. So I've been working mainly with little drawings that I'll show in the open studio. But I do have more work to show later, works that I did before. But I decided to bring this. I can wait in the. I'll leave this that out.
And could you recognize those bodies as a weak body or no?
Yes, I think this is interesting because I think the things are going to change a lot since I'm here. But one of the readings that I got somehow from these works is that they were very strong bodies, but somehow they were impotent. And I think this twist also interests me because I don't. I think it's bringing these ideas, but showing a very hard body in this case. But I don't know how the work is going to be like.
I think the size of the drawing is difficult. Drawing or smaller.
Oh, it's very big. Is that you can see it here, but it's 2 meters, 2.5 meters for 170 meters. So they're quite big. But you can. I don't think you can read it.
We can see from here. Maybe everyone is shy. We take. I have so many questions, but I mean, I think we can
Sure.
do it in a nice situation.
And I also think there are a lot of things to think about it, you know?
Yeah.
And then you need the time.
Something that for me really pops up quickly is this idea of a body that's okay. We are speaking a lot of body in crisis, but then are we speaking also about it that reacts? Because somebody's somehow it's a revolutionary body. When we speak about esgotamento, it's also something that can bring something positive and a reaction, or you leave it as a kind of just torsion and pain and suffer and apnea somehow. But yeah, I don't know if this is the question. But
Yes, I think we not necessarily our work is to provide answer, but to keep asking questions. And I think the state of esgotamento that he talks about and for me is very interesting is that one needs to be drained so another thing can come. This is not necessarily, of course, I'm not trying to make an illustration about the concept, but it's something that I've been thinking about, about this state of the body, about how one can be empty.
and it's funny how close it is to the way we try to periodize different historical Caesar, like we always talk about Renaissance, Baroque, but nothing is a closed ball. Like they were living it, and for us now, it's a temporary classification. But in reality, there was a very light movement from from something to another
Yes.
something, and to allow this movement, normally there is a kind of a revolution. Like normally one movement is always a bit slightly violating the rules of the previous one. Somehow there is always this kind of way of passing through the stages. And I think this is that's very visible, this connection we are speaking about. You're focusing on Baroque, but you are in the present. And for me, it's very nice how you can match two different time capsule and still being very fresh, and we can feel it come out.
Yes, I wanted to talk because there is not enough time here, but of course I look at very classical references, but also I'm a complete pop nerd, like pop culture nerd. So I think it's also the images are also related to video games and things, comic books and things like that. So I think it's good that you're talking about that because I think I play a little with these two universes.
Yeah, there is no possible for their vision. The folk is always influencing the eye and vice versa. It's kind of crazy how this working.
And I was thinking like the drawings, and after you have like the animation, and the animation is in loop, but I can also imagine those drawings in loop as well. And then I started thinking also about like personal things, like when you're in crisis, when you're weak, sometimes you don't know if you're doing something looking for a resolution, for a conclusion, or something to take you out of this crisis, or if you're doing something just because you need to do something and you're so used to this, this wicked feeling that you just do it without knowing what you're doing, and then you just keep doing, and you think that you're doing something, but actually you're doing nothing because you don't know why. I don't know, it got really like this looping, this movement.
I know.
Interesting.
Yes, and for me it's interesting this idea of not having images that are contextualized, like not working with the scene, but somehow sort of a loop image. And something that I've been thinking about here, because I've been making some cuts, some things with, I've been cutting some drawings. So I was thinking that this square thing was starting to bother me. So this is something new that started to appear for me in the residence. Also this loop idea.
You are escaping the frame.
Yeah, because here, I mean, you have a frame, but the images are kind of freer from these. Yes.
Maybe wait for you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oops.
Very nice.
Gente, deu pra entender?
Deu.
So the artist approach, I think, practice used to artist.
What is there? I can't see anything.
But you're here.
You're here? Okay. Well, I will start with a with a picture I made just today because I had this is a picture which is the follows directly on the end of Julia's speech because I felt so weak in the morning because my eyes are so bad. They went so bad here in Lisbon, and I felt that this is a wonderful picture for my estate, state of being now. So I didn't. I wanted to show it to you and just to talk about a little bit because I'm really a little bit dizzy in my eyes, but I will. I think I can manage it. So I will directly start with the title. This is Ghost in the Archives. I call this the Ghost in the Archives, territorial lines, ship lines, and wind lines. Light shifts of centers from Tordesillas lines to African colon portraits. About 2 years ago, I had the possibility to photograph a collection of African wooden figures from an ethnological collection. That was the first time I came into contact with African art. These are so-called colon figures or colonial figures, which were created in the 19th century, 20th century and made even today for touristic or auction purpose. They show the struggles of African artists with their colonial masters. Here you see the head, for instance, the colonial head of this person. They show black people with their European jackets, shirts, tropical helmets, the Bible, certain gestures. Here, for instance, are two figures which are painted white. This is a special connection to the black color of the skin, and deals with the white color of the European persons. They are, but at the same time, those sculptures show. This is also a woman sculpture, painted white. This is the missioner with the Bible. And this is a small figure I found here in the Ethnological Museum in Lisbon. Very, very tiny, but in the same style, with a European hat, a European shirt, and a jacket, and his eyes are really, what is it, squinting, I think is the word. And this is a special I miss the word now. A special view of this European figure, which is a little bit dizzy in his head, I think. I will now jump to one of my own drawings. This is a picture of a detail of a passage I'm still doing, but I nearly finished it. It is called Rausch. This is the translation of this These letters are risky, eccentric, unusual, synchronical changes. And this means a sort of ecstasy, border crossing, or being out of control. And you see another picture of it. And this is the interior of the passage. This is the construction. And this is a detail, which is a detail which I just made. The detail of the Treaty of Tordesillas, written, copied by me with red ink. And this is the first letter, very beautifully made. In my artistic work, I dealt at the same time with line systems in an earlier work, with straight and curved lines, with parallel line bundles, with guilloche. Guilloche are the security lines on banknotes and with lettering. And suddenly, with my application for the residency in Lisbon, in this beautiful artist space, Summertime, I realized which global issue lies in the combination of three important historical layers. The history of the Portuguese conquest of the African, in my case, African world, the ambiguous manifestations of colonized people in the 19th and 20th century, and my own past as a young drawing artist from the actual point of view. The history of conquest of the world, the famous nautical charge, slavery, murders, pillaging and plundering whole continents, today's restitution requirements, stolen art and clinging to old habits of museums, art historians, artistic seeking for an unbound freedom, sociologists, ethnologists, and not least the drowning of African people in the Mediterranean, etc. All this is concentrated in a particular medium, the World Nautical Chart, called Portolandschaft, a flat map made up of lines and colors. Although the drowning of the slaves is nowhere mentioned. Thinking of this huge context, many questions came up. What role do nautical charts play in the conquest of the world in the 15th and 16th centuries? How is art related to colonization? Which line systems exist in the arts and which are visible on old sea charts? Do line systems contribute to colonization, and when yes, in which way? How do colonial discourses and patterns of thinking survive in colonial archives? Or which attitudes become form in colonial archives? Just to change the title of Harald Seemann, when attitudes become form with its curatorial hierarchy. Or should I say, which attitudes are still very alive in colonial archives? I will come later to the archives. There are many marvelous maritime charts on the 15th and 16th centuries, covered with nets that were completely alien to me when I discovered them. They formed totally incomprehensible crisscross networks of chaos lines without recognizable order. This was the first thing, so I looked at this like that. And then I looked at lines for a long time in smaller and bigger resolutions that I could find in the internet, until I perceived the stars stars and rays from whose midpoint lines emanate in all directions. These lines combine with other radially symmetric star structures so that the intersections of their line jets form irregular triangles and quadrilaterals. The stars, with their rays, seem to hover over territories and areas of water like the Holy Spirit of God above the matter. They seem to me to be detached from the territorial signs that spread beneath them, but they also seem to insert themselves into circular systems that, like mathematical signs or algorithms, represent an abstract order that lies above unknown territories. For me, this unknown brought forth beauty and catastrophe fantasies that imagined the unknown continents, but in reality the network could be used to determine the direction a ship must take in its journey. As a navigation aid, Jakobstab, the Jakobsrod, compass and hourglass, the porcelain charts have been proven since 1217 and have been constantly improved and supplemented by the navigators. There are some of these beautiful stars, which, or they are drawn from also shown as compass stars. You surely know them all, but for me they were absolutely new when I found them. And here you see, this is the first time I show here this wonderful chart, the porcelain charts, which is called the Continuum Planisphere, and but here also with these circles which are showing where the stars are lying. That this is so to say the mathematical system which is lying above all. At the same time, Brazil was decorated with birds of paradise in the colors blue, red, and white. North Africa was shown as a palace that seems, yes, you see the palace there. That seems to dominate all of Africa. Small black people surround the palace in a circle. And little black people can also to be seen as in a suspended state. Just when you look very closely to the dove, underneath the dove there are 3 persons hanging. West Africa is shown as a bear, tiger, elephant, or other beasts are representations for other regions. For the oceans, sea monsters. Here's the bear. For Northwest Africa, and here are some of the beasts. This is not from the Continuum card, but from other cards which are of the same, nearly of the same time, 1539 in this case. This one is a snake which is terrorizing a boat. This is a funny creature. Sea monsters were invented indicating shipwrecks, straits and sandbars, thus fulfilling 2 functions, fanning the imagination and warning against the real shores. against this combination. The line rays not only cross their own lines, but are in turn superimposed by labeling systems from the conquering states in various sizes, shapes and colors. At the same time, there are written stories about something remarkable in the sea or in the new territories, as well as place names and outlines as coastlines. Here you see, I think it is drawing of Corsica. And I found very interesting these outlines, which are not the real outlines of a real island, but they are obviously drawn by circle and a ruler. And this is all the way the same in these charts when you look at the coastlines or at some other islands. And this is, for instance, a summary of islands which have the shape of letters. Here you see it very clearly how the coastlines are made. Here once more. And now I come to the angels. Thus, lines, water and territories are entangled with a mathematical line order on a flat surface and presented as a complex network of shipping, adventurousness, sovereign conquest and power interests, mathematical calculation systems, free animal and human fantasies and wind lines. The puff-cheeked wind heads from the cosmic aspect of this composite system. In German it is Verbundsystem, which is more, I think it's more clear what it is, what I mean with this. Verbundsystem, this is when things are connected. Composite system is more like a composition, so I'm not really sure with this word. But anyway, this composite system which refers to the space above the territories and over the seas. Wind heads represent winds that blow from all. Now it becomes a little bit critical for me with my eyes. I warned you, and I beg your pardon. Okay. So they blow out the four corners. They blow out of the four corners of a flat map or circles hovering over the map. Here you see other examples of these wind heads, which are all the way going around the world, the whole world, and blowing something to the world. Here they are made in another way. Can you see? Well, it is not so good. The picture is not so, they are not so good to be seen. But this you see very well, and of course everybody knows what it is. We will make a real jump to nowadays. This is the fascist building of the Torre de Tombo, and one of the wind heads I photographed when I was here in June. The wind heads of the fascist building, the archive Torre de Tombo, are playing the role of the heroic past. I will come to it later. But I couldn't resist to show two of the spectacular fountains. This is once more this monument, I can say. And this I couldn't resist to show you these two pictures in the mirror of the Torre de Tombo. The moment of the emperors, thinking about the fountains, I realized that a fountain is built out of thousands of water drops coming in lines. This comes quite close to the old and intensive discussion whether points are forming a line, or is a line just drawn, or a trace, or a track. These water drops are, so to say, a connection between the ocean, the maps, the stars, the emperors, and, in another point of view, the fountain of Duchamp. This is now the real map, which is never the real map, of course. But this is the map I was so much searching for, and I didn't get the original, but nevertheless, I found a very good resolution in the internet, and so I can show it to you here. The so-called Continuum Planisphere of 1502 is the geometric lines are to be read as a momentous, squeeze, abstract, ordering power which inscribes itself, quotation, into a natural territory which is in itself free of lines. End of quotation from the Octinal. This is a map in which portolan lines appear simultaneously with the tortillas line, with the construction lines, the tortillas lines. The Pope had tried to settle the dispute over the conquered areas in South America and the whole other world between Portugal and Spain. Of course, you know it all. But for me, it was not so clear when I started to do the project. When the tortillas line from 1494, and the world was to be divided into Portuguese and Spanish rule, but this didn't function, as we all know. In the Renaissance, portolan charts where you can see this interference, or the mixing of geographical and political interests. All types of lines are of particular interest to me because they reveal a means of representation that plays an important role in Renaissance art and cartography as well. It becomes quite clear that the portolan charts are a composite system of very different lines: fonts, straight lines, curved lines, contours, border lines, grid lines, connecting lines, etc., form a highly complex, variable unit with many different functions and demands. Last but not least, the rastering of the Earth's surface plays an important role. That means the rastering, that means in a Mercator projection, plays an important role. In them, line drawings and the Earth's surface work together. First, primarily, portolan lines are the crucial medium for the collapse of two-dimensional, flat paper and three-dimensional Earth surface. Second, as shipping lines, they are signposts. Third, as writings, they are information carriers of sovereign power. Fourth, as contours, they are more locations than real shorelines. Fifth, they serve a grid not only, this is the quotation here, all the way from Jörg Dünne and Bernhard Sieger. They serve a grid not only to the order or transfer principle of existing, but to the planning basis of the still to be built order of rooms, and serves to address or control of the people to be settled in the newly built cities. In this respect, it can be argued that the grid as a construction principle of colonial cities already anticipates certain aspects of biopolitical population control in the sense of Michael Foucault. Here is the first Mercator projection, which I only wanted to show you. I don't want to discuss it now because it becomes too much about all these maps. We together found in the tombo. It is a only a print of a book to be seen in a book, but I found it very beautiful and also very informational, because there are both of the Tordesillas lines, the one over Brazil and this one here on the right side. Here you have the half of the same picture. So this is now the map again. In this context, I'm interested in the question of whether the Portulan lines are similar to creative processes and rhizomatic thinking. Creative thought processes are referred to as detours, rhizomed, crooked ways, but in reality they produce unusual direct connections between 2 points, like the old Portulan lines which connected 2 ports. They are not bound to a grid network with a defined point and location system, but represent a dynamic network that connects different points together. The Deleuze rhizome refers to a map rather than a drawing, a painting, or a photograph. Now, quotation: the rhizome is an acentric, non-hierarchical, asignificant system without a general. End of quotation. Richard Heinrich of Deleuze, 1,000 Photos. The Portulan cards reveal a complex knowledge and thinking in compound systems, which comes very close to my research, to my own rhizomatic archive system, which I called Unarchived. In my own reflections on the line, I developed the reflectography. As a reflective medium, it has the line in between 2 media. The 2 medias are a drawing and a photography, which are interreflecting with a computer screen. The reflectography has a refraction line, which is capable of directly reflecting the fluctuating movements of my hand and my body as a forming process. The the reflective line is a straight line that creates shapes in the same moment when the glass touches the computer screen. It is also a borderline that creates interlocking forms so that it is no longer possible to speak of a boundary, but of the line as an area. Invention of the form is no longer fixed on the invention of geometric outer contours, as suggested by separation of territory and drawing, to be seen in the Portulan chart, but the line with two significance coincide within one image. Going back to the rump lines, which are the Portulan lines, although the geometric outlines of the islands and the coastlines, as well as rump lines on Portulan maps, form a composite system of various line media, they do signify the separation between territory and external border, between land and cosmos. Maybe I could say that together with a grid projection, attempts were being made on the world's Portulan chart to establish the dichotomous separation between inside and outside, which we are so much questioning today. The Continuum chart is of such great importance because it is the first map showing this transition between two systems, not only between two fighting nations, but also between the world projections or the world drafts. This leads me to a confrontation with the archive, as I said before, and the archive with a capital A, and the archiving. And now two questions to this. Where are the documents of the slaves themselves and how they were treated? Where are the documents of the struggles, their rebellions, their cooperations or collaborations with the emperors, written, sung, or documented by themselves? In archives, documents are stored, which others have selected. In addition, sovereignty rights have to do with the selection and appreciation of what, and most importantly, who is allowed to be the subject of history. This became very clear in my efforts to gain access to the originals in the archive here in Lisbon. Our experience, that means the experience of three women, Gemma, Julia and I, and me, was the Arquivo de Torre de Tombo is still regarding its sovereign rights, hiding its treasures, and it is not at all interested in any research which is not authorized by its, instead of its own authority. That means that the archive is a circle in itself. It is a colonial archive which holds all the documents of the colonial past, and at the same time only people seem to have the possibility to look at that past with the eyes of the colonizer himself. And this means we stare at these wonderful charts again and again in the delusion of our own colonial thinking. Thus, the circular lines of the Portulan charts become a complete different meaning. Become a complete different meaning. The circle line is not only the invisible line for the stars with radiant lines for the sailors, foreign animals and sea monsters, but builds a structure of still working thinking in nowadays archives. In this they present circulating in themselves, cuddling up perhaps unconsciously but tightly to a colonial tradition. But some other experience with other archives are still outstanding. Gemma and me, we are visiting on Monday an archive with original Portulan charts, and we hope that my doubts about archival system is as a closed institution will be destroyed somehow. The last image I'm still working on is the adaptation of the Continuum map as the basis for African slavery and all those who died on the seas. They are the real subjects of the seas without a voice. You see that I took these two circles and put on a few of my reflectographies on it. Well, this was my what I have to say, and now I just want to show a video which is 7 minutes long. If it is too long, then you might go out, but I would like to show it. It has a title. I change the title so often, so I have to look. Mask Also Dance, which is a reference to Chris Marker and Alain Resnais, to the title Statues Also Die, and so I took the title Mask Also Dance. Thank you.